Hello, Ram.
Hello all. Thank you all for joining us today for our panel discussion on public spending in agriculture in India. So I'd just like to begin by introducing the organizer for today, Foundation for Agrarian Studies. Our major objectives here at FAS are to facilitate and sponsor multidisciplinary, theoretical and empirical inquiry in the field of agrarian studies in India and elsewhere in less developed countries. We do so in association with a wide section of people interested in the agrarian question, including people associated with academic institutions, members of mass organizations working in the countryside, and other professionals and scholars. We have organized today's panel in collaboration with Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung South Asia. I'd like to now hand it over to Deepak Johnson, who will be moderating today's panel. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nehira, and good evening, everyone. India's agricultural growth has historically been dependent on the investments made by the public sector. The new agricultural strategy of the 1960s came about as a response to inadequate food production. The Green Revolution that led to a significant increase in overall agricultural production and productivity was made possible by state intervention in terms of research and development, extension services, prices, credit, and marketing. While there were limitations, the decades following the 1960s also saw an expanding national agricultural research system, which played an influential role in India's self-sufficiency. However, there has been a withdrawal of state from agriculture after the 1990s. To assess how investments by the state have changed over time, the Foundation for Agrarian Studies conducted a study on public expenditure in Indian agriculture from 2010-11 to 2019-20. This research was part of a larger project that compared government expenditure in agriculture across 4 countries, including India, which was supported by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. Our study found that the public expenditure has continued to decline in the last decade, with changing emphasis across different subsectors within agriculture. Through this session, we attempt to present some findings of this study, examine the areas that have suffered the most under the milieu of declining expenditures, and discuss the implications of this situation for the future. We have 2 sets of presentations for today. First, a brief presentation of the project report prepared by FAS. This presentation will be made by Raya Das and Abhinav Surya. Raya is an economic geographer and submitted her PhD thesis on agrarian dynamics and organization of production in West Bengal at the Center for the Study of Regional Development at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Abhinav is a research scholar in applied economics at the Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram, and holds an MTech in product design from the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Both Raya and Abhinav were members of the FAS project team. Second part of the discussion has presentations by our panelists. Our first panelist is R. Ram Kumar, Professor, School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Professor Ram Kumar has worked extensively on agriculture and agrarian change in rural India. His forthcoming book, titled Distress in the Fields, examines the different aspects of Indian agriculture after economic liberalization. Professor Ram Kumar led the FAS project on public expenditure in agriculture. Our second panelist for today is Dr. Vijoo Krishnan, Joint Secretary, All India Kisan Sabha. As an organizer of the Kisan movement, Vijoo was in the forefront of recent farmers' protests and many other struggles, including the Kisan Long March Maharashtra. He holds a PhD in political science from the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Our third panelist is Dr. S. Niyati, Associate Scientist, International Rice Research Institute. Niyati has a PhD in development studies from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Her research examined female labor absorption in rice cultivation across different agroecological regions in India. So the format for today's event is as follows. First, Raya and Abhinav would present the key findings from the report for about 10 minutes. Secondly, the panelists will present on different aspects related to public spending in agriculture, each about 15 minutes. This will be followed by a question and answer session. With this introduction, let me welcome Raya Das and Abhinav Surya for their presentation. Over to you, Raya and Abhinav.
Yeah, thank you, Deepak, for the introduction, and also thank you for the opportunity to work on this project and also present our work. Abhinav, can you please share the screen? Yeah. So to just give a brief context of the report, we start from the characteristics from liberalization era. So the liberalization era was characterized with input-intensive agriculture, market reforms, shifting to high-value crops, promotion of private sector research in agriculture, apathy towards land reform policies, and integration to global value chain by contract farming, corporatization of agriculture. So there has been also an increasing pressure of environmental degradation, groundwater depletion, soil conservation, and climate change. In this context, it is important to analyze the state's intervention in agricultural policies in terms of public expenditure in the sector to assess the path of agrarian transition in the country. So the purpose of this report is to analyze the trends, patterns, and composition of public spending in agriculture. So the time period is from 2010-11 to 1920. So the data set for the report is based on the Indian government budget published annually. So there is also the data set concludes the functional classification of a sectoral composition like crop husbandry, irrigation, rural development, and also department or ministry-wise classification like Ministry of Agriculture, Farmers Welfare, the Jal Shakti, and all the different other ministries which has agriculture-related schemes. So these schemes are coded based on subjective indicators of agrarian transition like technological development, crop diversifications, and all these indicators are clubbed to address the four main objectives of the report. That one is the transformation of agricultural system, alternative agricultural practices, state sovereignty, and spending towards vulnerable section of the society. Will you please change the slide? Yeah. So the main four indicators are used for the study. One is that public expenditure ratio, which is the total expenditure of government to gross value added. Second is agriculture orientation ratio, which indicates the expenditure in agriculture sector to total expenditure of that year. Third is agriculture priority ratio, which illustrates that within agriculture, how the different sectors expenditure is divided. And fourth is agricultural expenditure ratio, which estimates expenditure in different sectors of agriculture to GVA of agriculture. So as you see in terms of public expenditure across different countries, there is a cross-country heterogeneity in terms of public expenditure as a percentage to GDP. So even you can see that in India, the value is other than a few years, the value is even lower than South Africa. Next. So if we see the public expenditure in India as a percentage of GDP, if we see that there is a kind of plateau and followed by smooth decline after 2015. So simultaneously, there is also burden on state government. So if we look at the ratio of the state and the central government budget in agriculture, there is a trend of increase, and which also shows the characteristics of fiscal consolidation policies of central government, which the motto is to reduce the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP. Next. So if we see now the agriculture sector, the trend is kind of similar. And also we see that the burden on state government has been increased compared to central government. And also the share of expenditure in agriculture has been decreased from 11% to 9.5% between 2010 to 20. So we can conclude from this graph that the share of agriculture in GVA, where it was decreased from 18.2% to 17%, the decrease in expenditure is even more. So please change to the next slide. Yeah, here we'll look at the subsectors of agriculture and expenditure pattern here. So the basic and gigantic share within agriculture sector is mainly the crop husbandry, food storage, and within that PM Kisan comprises 64% share of central sector in last budget. And also there is a kind of increase in crop husbandry after 2018 due to launch of the PM Kisan scheme, which is like cash transfer, direct cash transfer scheme of rupees 6,000 per family for farmers. And but like there are also like direct income, indirect income support schemes also, like market intervention schemes like that. But the implementation part of it needs to be evaluated from the household level data. And we at food storage, we see that there is a decline in the investment by government. Also, the in the pandemic time, we see that many perishable loss of many perishable commodities, which indicates the immediate attention to of expenditure in this sector. And also there has been a decline in research activities and extension services in agriculture sector. Next. So when the expenditure towards date wave scheme and interest subvention, which my colleague Abhinav will discuss in detail, that has been increased in last decade, one of the major cause of farmers' suicide and agrarian distress remains scarcity of irrigation water. So it's both in agriculturally advanced region and also if we see the backward region, depending on the agroecological condition. From the functional expenditure, we see that both the AR and APR for irrigation have increased. But it is also important to note that major share of this expenditure is by central and state, like clubbed expenditure for irrigation. 96% of the expenditure on irrigation are made by state government. So we see that AER for irrigation has been a decreasing trend if we club both union plus state. And there has also been an increasing trend towards water-saving micro-irrigation and also water-saving technologies and decline investment in irrigation infrastructure. The AER, if we see the decline from 5.6 in 2010 to around 4 in 2019. So servicing loans from NABARD comprises 41% of Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, and the expenditure under PMKSY has also declined since 2016. However, the question remains the regional differences in irrigation expenditure by states impacting uneven development and increase in price of water at country levels.
Only the share is declined.
Sorry. There is, if we look at the state level expenditure, this is union plus state. The graph shows union plus state. So there is, of course, regional variation, and the report it does not address specific states, but there is a little drop. But, and also change in expenditure towards minor irrigation and micro irrigation expenditure pattern. Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Abhinav, you can start.
Thank you, Nehira. Thank you, Raya. Going ahead, we also, as we see from the earlier slides, the major characteristics of public expenditure in India over the past decade has been the drop in expenditure as a percentage of agricultural GVA in real production, as in terms of real support for real crop cultivation production in agriculture, as in support for crop husbandry, research and extension, irrigation, etc. So in other aspects, we also looked at the expenditure towards fertilizer subsidies and other rural support schemes of the central government. So here we see the support towards fertilizer, Department of Fertilizers in public expenditure of the central government. As claimed by the central government, any expenditure, whether it goes towards industries or towards farmers, the expenditure on Department of Fertilizers, expenditure by Department of Fertilizers, essentially will reflect as a benefit for the farmers. That is a claim by the central government. So we analyze the total expenditure of the central government towards Department of Fertilizers. As we can see, the share as a percentage of agricultural GVA has once again declined over the past decade. And also looking at the schemes, we see that over the past decades is characteristically, the past decade can be characterized as the extreme sharpening of rural crisis. During this period, although the percentage of expenditure as a percentage of agriculture GVA towards rural employment, especially MGNREGA scheme, has not declined severely, but it has remained stagnant, where the need, whereas there was a need to increase it due to the sharpening of rural crisis. And also we see that we looked at, while all these are declining, we looked whether the central government is increasing its share to grants in aids to states to execute central government schemes by the states. We see that that is also not the case, and it has also seen a decline. The kink in the middle is due to a change in characterization alone, but overall trend we can see that there is a decline. And yes, this is one of the most important characteristics of the public expenditure by central government towards agriculture, where we earlier saw that the expenditure towards real production, that is real crop cultivation, has declined as a percentage of agriculture GVA. The expenditure towards financial institutions as a percentage of agriculture GVA has increased. So these are allocations towards schemes like interest subsidies. So while the support for real agricultural production has declined in terms of agricultural GVA, where the support for real production is what reflects as the capacity of the farmers to generate their own income. While that has declined by the central government, schemes like so interest subsidies and financial allocation towards financial institutions, that has increased. So we can characterize this as financialization of public expenditure towards agriculture. That's one of the main characteristics. So, and finally, we look at the much touted claims about transformation of agriculture towards diversification of crops, towards usage of less chemical intensive agriculture. So what we see is we looked at the expenditure towards support for schemes like horticulture and other crop diversification measures, and also towards schemes like organic farming. Although there is a much talk on zero budget farming and other such measures, again, the percentage of allocation towards these crop diversification and plant protection schemes and organic farming schemes, they have declined. Especially these include schemes like Pradhan Mantri Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana and other such schemes. So these as a percentage of again agriculture GVA has declined, and this has happened at a stage when the pesticide usage in terms of kilogram per hectare by our country's farmers has remained almost constant. So we see that there is no real evidence for transformation of agriculture through public expenditure by the union government during this last decade. Here we present the short summary. So as we can see, even in terms of total agriculture, as well as in terms of total expenditure, as well as in terms of agriculture expenditure, the burden is being shifted away from the central government towards state governments. This is happening.
We can't see any slides. We're not seeing any slides, Abhinav. We have not seen any of your slides. We have not seen any slides from you.
Mute him. Mute him. Mute him.
No,
I have not seen any slides from Abhinav. He says, as you can see.
Yeah, we are able to see.
Sorry, am I?
Yeah, so Abhinav, can we wind it up? So we can come back to this later in the question and answer session.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry to cut you short for want of time, Abhinav. So, but thank you, Raya and Abhinav. We can come back to it later in the Q&A session. For now, let's carry on with the panelists. I welcome Professor Ram Kumar for his presentation, and maybe he can also explain a bit about the methodology and other questions that were coming up in the chat while he's making his presentation.
Thank you, Deepak. Deepak, let's take all those questions, including those on methodology, in the Q&A session. I don't think we should take it up now, otherwise it will be a bit of a digression.
Yeah, sure.
Let's take the 2 or 3 questions that the organizers had put to me and other panelists to sort of answer. One is the overall question of public expenditure. that is not including agriculture, but overall public expenditure stance of the central government. One has to understand that this public expenditure to GDP ratio in India is one of the lowest in the world. There's no question about it. That's the overall context in which we are discussing this issue. If you take the public expenditure to GDP ratio, it is close to 33% in the USA. It is close to 29% in Germany. It's close to 43% in Italy, and so on and so forth. I can go on. Even in Brazil, it's about 34%. In India, it's only close to 15%, as the report points out in one of its initial sections. This also is a reflection of the very low expenditure in India on not just agriculture, but also education, health, etc. When countries like Norway spend about 9.2% of their GDP on education, India spends close to 3% only. If countries like Sweden spend up to 10% of their GDP on health, India spends close to 1.5%. If you take the overall human power in the government, like for example, the number of government servants per lakh people, if you take here, you will see that the number of government servants per lakh people is only about 1,700 in India, while it is about 7,500 in the United States. If you take the share of government employees, government employment in total employment, that's another proxy in the question that we are discussing. The share of government employment in total employment is 30% in Norway, 29% in Sweden, 28% in Denmark, 22% in France, just 4% in India. Right. So if you see, there is an overall shortage of human power in the social sector in India. We need about 11 lakh more school teachers, according to an estimate. We need at least 6 lakh more doctors. We need at least 20 lakh more nurses. At this rate, a calculation shows that we will take at least 57 years to reach the number of doctors that the OECD countries have. Right? What does all this show? This basically shows that our overall public expenditure is unacceptably low in this country, right? And one of the big reasons for this is India's very low tax GDP ratio, which simply does not equip the government to spend more. Of course, it can borrow and spend as well, but its tax GDP ratio, which is a primary indicator of how much the government can spend, is very low. It's about 12% in India, but it is about 25% in the United Kingdom. It is about 25% in France, 21% in Finland, etc., etc. Right? So this is the first point. The overall public expenditure is very low in India. This reflects in agriculture, but in agriculture there is a bit of a problem, because as the share of the population that is dependent on agriculture is very high in India, if you take a countrywide comparison, the amount of expenditure in agriculture will appear to be relatively high in India, but that does not in any way mean that the expenditure is adequate. A simple example is there in the report itself. I'm going to just give it as an illustration. If you take public expenditure on agricultural research, public investment in agricultural research, you will see that it's about 0.6% in India, as the report's section points out. 0.5% of the agricultural GDP is invested in public agricultural research. How much is it in developed countries? 2 to 3%. What is the average for developing countries? 0.65%, which is higher than India's expenditure on, in public investment on agricultural research. So this, like that, we can sort of show many indicators, present many indicators, but basically the point is that public expenditure is unacceptably low, both as a share of the GDP and as an absolute figure, as with regard to the requirement for the population in the country. Let's come to the second question that the organizers had posed to me and other panelists, which is the overall center-state relationship in this dynamics of public expenditure. It is a fact that the overall transfers of revenue and of resources from the center to the states has been on a decline for a while. And this has raised very serious questions on the very future of federalism as a concept, as a constitutional concept, as a political concept in this country. Why do we say this? I will not expand on this, but I'll just give you 2 or 3 indicators to show the overall impact of this problem. If you take the share of cesses and surcharges in the total revenues of the central government, which is an indicator of this whole problem of federal transfer, because only tax revenues are shareable in the divisible pool according to the Indian Constitution. But if the central government collects money through cesses and surcharges, they are not shareable with states. So the central government's idea or objective has been, over a long period of time now, to collect more and more money through cesses and surcharges so that they do not enter into the divisible pool. This has led over a period of time to a shrinkage of the overall amount of resources transferred from the center to the states. So the share of cesses and surcharges in the total revenue of the central government was only 10% in 2011-12, that is 10 years back, right? 10.4%. Take 2021, it is about 20%. That is, it has literally doubled in a decade. 10% to 20%. This is why the finance commissions over 14th and 15th, in particular, suggested that grants in aid to the states should actually go up in order to compensate for the transfer of tax devolutions to the states. However, grants in aid have not gone up to the extent to which tax devolutions have fallen. Right? It has not been able to adequately compensate for that fall. As a result, what you have is the total transfer to the states, including non-FC transfers, non-finance commission transfers, was about 53% in about 2011-12. It is now about 49%. Right? Very clearly, there is a fall in the total flow of resources from center to the states. Number one. Number two, the nature of centrally sponsored schemes has changed drastically over the last few years. Earlier, or if you take about a decade back, if you will see that the nature of centrally sponsored schemes, they were mostly in the nature of 90:10 or 80:20 kind of schemes. In other words, 90 is contributed by the center and 10 is contributed by states, or 80 is contributed by center, 20 by states. Now, over a period of time, that ratio has been changing. That ratio has been changing to 60-40 or even 50-50. Right? So 50% has to be given by the states in many schemes now. Now, the problem here is that overall transfers to the states are falling relative to the overall incomes that the central government is receiving. And within that, there is an increasing burden on the state governments to contribute if they want to access or get benefit of the centrally sponsored schemes. Otherwise, they simply are forced to opt out of that scheme. Right? This is another important problem that has come up over the last few years. The guidelines of centrally sponsored schemes are also a real problem. There is the Interstate Commission for a long period of time has been citing the Ramamurthy Commission for I forget the year in which that report was submitted, but basically it said that only if it meets a certain sets of criteria should a scheme be called centrally sponsored. Right? And the guidelines of that scheme should be flexible enough so that all states can actually get the benefit or can access those funds. And there should not be of a blanket variety, one size fits all variety across the country. That has been consistently violated. Guidelines for centrally sponsored schemes are still not flexible enough for all states, given the agroecological diversity in this country, to benefit from that flow of funds. That's the other problem. So basically, this puts more burden on the states. Guidelines are not uniform. This squeezes the states considerably, and this has posed a serious question on the very future of the idea of federalism, as I began this presentation with. The farm laws, the implementation of the farm laws, which were a gross violation of the federal principles in the Constitution, an affront to those principles, can be cited as only the one of the most recent examples of such violations into federalism. And the question that we are discussing now, the flow of funds from center to states and its allocation to agriculture, etc., is yet another illustration of that problem that we have been having for a while. Let me come to the third question that the organizers had put to me. The overall question of falling expenditure in agriculture, in particular, the sector of the subsector of crop husbandry, which has been seeing a precipitous fall in public expenditure in real absolute terms. There was a question in the box which basically was asking about, is it only about shares? No, we are talking about a real absolute fall in the expenditure on crop husbandry in the central government budgets till about 2018, of course. What happened in 2018? PM Kisan happened. 75,000 crore was set aside for the PM Kisan scheme, and which comes under crop husbandry. As a result, the budget for crop husbandry got inflated like a balloon, right? But this is the only item. The report points this out very clearly. The increase in expenditure on PM Kisan is the only item in the central government budget for agriculture which appears to have increased in any significant way, right? And this is the transfer of rupees 6,000 rupees per household per year under the particular scheme. Now, this has a particular context to it. But over the last few years, there is this whole discussion related to how to address questions related to the agrarian crisis and so on. And some people did point out that we need debt waivers or loan waivers as a solution to this, but that was not acceptable to neoliberal policymakers because it was ideologically not acceptable to them. Some others were pointing to higher MSPs, but then neoliberal economists pointed out that it will lead to higher inflation, and hence, it would also be fiscally burdensome, and it will not be acceptable. And then the Madhya Pradesh example of compensating for lower MSPs through what is called as the Bhavantar Bhugtan Yojana, BBY, also had flopped in Madhya Pradesh because traders effectively colluded and defeated that scheme, basically left the central government with very little options by 2017 and 2018 to confront policy-wise the agrarian crisis across the country. That was the time when states like Telangana moved into what is called as the Raitu Bandhu scheme, where 8,000 rupees per acre per year was transferred into the bank accounts of farmers. Later, Odisha came in with the Kalia scheme, where rupees 10,000 was given to not on a per hectare per acre basis, per family per year. And this was replicated in the Indian scheme of union government scheme of PM Kisan, where rupees 6,000 per family per year is now transferred in 3 installments of rupees 2,000 each. The first point about this transfer scheme is that it is very, very, very low. Right? It's basically a transfer of 500 rupees per month to a household. And for a 5-member household, this translates to rupees 100 per month. Right? It means nothing to a farmer household at the ground level. That's the first problem with this particular scheme. But there are also different other problems with this scheme. The first problem here is related to the whole question of universalism and targeting. What is the point here? If you have a universal scheme, you give it to everybody. There is no problem. But here, you have to identify a farmer and give it to that farmer. That means it is a targeted scheme. The moment you have a targeted scheme at hand, what you will need is to identify your beneficiaries. But do you have a database of farmers in India? Hardly. Right? The union government began the scheme by saying we are going to include 14 crore households. Vijoo Krishnan is here. He'll speak more about this, I'm sure. 14 crore farmers. But how much did they cover? For a long period of time, they covered only 8 to 9 crore farmers. Now they're claiming that it has gone up to 11 to 12 crore farmers during COVID, but still it is a contested number as to how many farmers that we have in India. Why is that? Because we simply do not have updated and modernized land records in this country. Most of the land records are from the colonial time, updated, yes, but very poorly updated and maintained as a result, and hardly digitized, of course. And this has meant that we simply do not have good data on land records in this country. That's one of the reasons why this whole confusion around the number of farmers exists. But then there are also a lot of inclusion and exclusion errors in this whole process. As in any other targeted scheme, you will see that most of the tenants in India are excluded from the PM Kisan scheme because they simply do not have land records, and most tenancies are not recorded. They are oral in nature. Landless agricultural laborers are excluded from the scheme for obvious reasons. They simply do not have land. Administrative costs are very high for such a scheme because you have to identify a farmer first. As a result, you simply take a database as given by the states, which immediately leads to a huge problem of exclusion. As you can see, across different states, many people are being asked to return the money which was paid to them under PM Kisan scheme because an auditing found out that they were ineligible beneficiaries. And many people, of course, tenants, agricultural laborers, and those who have land and do cultivate them, but their name do not appear in the land records, they are also left out of the scheme. So there are both inclusion errors and exclusion errors in the scheme, and this has led to problems of itself. Basically, in my view, I'm going to stick my neck out and say this today. This is essentially a cop-out for the central government. The central government's policies failed miserably in increasing the incomes of farmers, let alone doubling it. The central government schemes failed to increase productivity. The central government's budgets failed to invest or spend adequately in agriculture. And given the rising rural anger, rural unrest among the population, it was left with no other option but to introduce a cash transfer scheme to assuage the feeling of anger in the rural areas. That is the primary objective of the PM Kisan scheme. If you I was in a presentation last week in my institute where one of my colleagues showed a very interesting graph, which basically was a bar graph showing the number of beneficiaries of PM Kisan in the year 21-22. The tallest bar was for Uttar Pradesh, right? And it is, one has to see that graph to believe it. It is so significantly taller than most other states that that bar speaks for itself in terms of the ultimate election outcome that we had in that state. So this has become a kind of a political instrument and not a policy for farmers' welfare. And that means that the scheme like PM Kisan has to be very critically evaluated by the left and the progressive sections of the society in terms of its appropriateness. If rupees 75,000 crore is invested every year for about 10 to 15 years, you get a total investment of 10 lakh crores in terms of capital expenditure in this country. Deepak, I'm done in 30 seconds. So that is a total investment that comes into the rural areas if you invest rupees 10 lakh crores. If you move out of PM Kisan and invest it in the form of capital expenditure in the rural areas of this country. So I'm a big skeptic of the PM Kisan scheme, and I think that scheme should be very critically relooked at, given its performance over the years. The last point is related to irrigation. Just 20 seconds, Deepak, I'll close it. Here, the key question, as the report very clearly points out, is a very sharp fall in public investment in irrigation. A fall of public investment in irrigation, which has gone hand in hand with a rise of private investment in irrigation. This rise in private investment in irrigation, and I think Tapas Singh Modak is here, he's written a very interesting PhD thesis on this, which basically shows that if you look at the total spread of surface water to groundwater exploitation in this country over the last 70 years, the surface water to groundwater ratio was about 57 to 29 in the early years of independence. We've literally reversed it even and made it even worse now, which is about 25% for surface water now and 64% for groundwater. It's a very interesting data point because public investment has simply failed to expand surface water irrigation in this country outside a few pockets. And this has meant that farmers have autonomously invested in groundwater schemes, tube wells, bore wells, etc. And that has led to its own problems with regard to the water tables and so on. This has been yet another facet of the problem of declining public investment and expenditure in agriculture. I'll stop here, Deepak, and maybe other questions we can take up in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ram Kumar. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and some of them have already come up in the Q&A and chat boxes. If you have time during this presentation, you can prepare for that. Now, let me welcome Dr. Vijoo Krishnan for his presentation. Over to you, Dr. Vijoo Krishnan.
Thank you, Deepak. A very useful report from the Foundation of Agrarian Studies. And as far as the neoliberal economic policies or the new agriculture policy is concerned, the All India Kisan Sabha and the All India Agriculture Workers Union are probably the first organizations representing the farm-dependent population, which came out very openly against these set of policies when in 92 itself, in the 27th All India Conference of the All India Kisan Sabha at Hisar in Haryana, very clear position was taken that it is going to lead to have an adverse impact on the peasantry and lead to pauperization of the poor, small and middle farmers. Today, we have seen the manifestation of these policies have been that it has led to extreme indebtedness, falling prices for farmers, and agriculture becoming unremunerative. While on the other hand, you also have an increasing costs of cultivation because the prices of the inputs are totally, the control over the prices of inputs have been removed. There has been a deregulation, and the companies are deciding, the agri-businesses are deciding the prices of these inputs. So that is leading to a situation where the costs of cultivation are increasing, the farmers' incomes are shrinking, and farmers are pushed into a situation of indebtedness, leading to the huge distress and the farm suicides that have been happening. Even conservative reports would say in the last 3 decades, almost 4 lakh farmers and agriculture labor have committed suicide due to the crisis. So while the first plan, if you look at the first plan, probably informed by the situation existing at that time of a backward agriculture and low productivity, the experience of the Great Bengal famine and so on, there was an emphasis on agriculture with, if I am right, maybe around 33% in the first plan for agriculture and irrigation. And that decline, it has been pointed out in this report, how the decline in different budgets also, there has been a continuous decline of public investment in agriculture that we have seen. But in 2014, Narendra Modi and BJP had come up with a lot of promises, including that the implementation of the Swaminathan Commission recommendation of C2+50, assuring farmers produce at least 50% more than the cost of production, was one of the most attractive promises. Doubling of farmers' incomes, cheaper credit, the insurance if there is crop loss, enhanced investment into NREGA, and if also the slogan of Har Khet Ko Pani. What you are trying to address in this report, look into in this report, on all of those there had been promises which actually would have entailed a huge increase in public investment in agriculture and rural development. But we are seeing that there is a systematic fall. So what has that situation led to? The claim of the doubling of farmers' incomes. Recently, the economic survey itself came up with figures that the monthly income of an agriculture household is only something like 10,000, average monthly income is only 10,218. And if you see from cultivation of crops, then it is something like 3,798. And per day, if you look at per person, then it is only around 27 rupees from cultivation of crops. Ram Kumar rightly mentioned about how the investment on crop husbandry and all that also has been followed. The other questions that you have raised here, how the GST regime and the increasing burdens on the state governments. If you look at the policies like the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, many of the states, especially the economically poorer states, unable to bear even that small expense, the limited expense that the state is supposed to make. So it is something which we are seeing in different policies. Ram rightly mentioned that the share of the state, even in centrally sponsored schemes, to be increased, sometimes even up to the 50%. That is something which we are seeing. Regarding the other issue of direct cash being transferred, Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman Nidhi is has been in a big way. They have been just before the elections in 2019. It was announced even on the day of polling. The first installment of 2,000 coming into the accounts, especially in Uttar Pradesh, in Karnataka, in Madhya Pradesh, and so on, in a way that it would influence the voting pattern. That is something. But when it was first announced, the claim was that 14 crore farmers would benefit from it. But later we find suddenly, without any explanation, about 8.6 crores only benefiting initially. Now the claim is that about 12.5 crore farmers are going to. Where from these figures are arrived at? That is something to be. And who are the beneficiaries? The tenant cultivators. If you take the example of Andhra Pradesh alone, more than 33 lakh tenant cultivators. They are not getting the benefit of these policies. Often it is absentee landlords sitting in urban centers who are benefiting from this. You also find new kind of agricultural money lenders emerging who are getting the benefits of these schemes and then leading to lending of at high interest rates. This is also something we are witnessing in some of these states. We have, for instance, in Kerala, a crop-based subsidy that is being done. Different crops per hectare subsidy that is given to the farmers. I think with the panchayats also playing a role in identifying the actual cultivator. That is that kind of an approach is also not there. If you look at the pandemic period, we have all seen that there has been a huge harvesting and marketing crisis and loss of incomes for the peasantry, for the agriculture labor, but nothing being done by this government. No investment in the direction of ensuring that these income losses could be in some way addressed or generating employment in the rural areas. If you look at the recent study of the periodic labor force survey for 2017-18, farm dependents, agriculture labor and cultivators, the percentage which was 42.5% has increased to 45.6%. Very clearly, this is post demonetization and GST. We find from the urban centers, those pauperized peasantry who had gone in search of jobs being forced to come back to the villages, back to agriculture. That is a situation which we are facing. Surely post-pandemic, that number must have increased. What is being done? What is the investment in that direction? That is something which we here all of us are concerned about. Nothing being done in that direction. Simultaneously, you have talk of trade liberalization, free trade agreements and all that, which is leading to direct linking of the farmers with the volatile world market prices and the burden of price crashes falling on the cultivators. That is also, you look at the different commodity boards, which are systematically finishing off these commodity boards by ensuring that the allocations are cut down in a systematic manner. That is recently they have come up with different amendment bills to rubber board, to the tea, spices, and also coffee board, all in the name of ease of doing business to increase the efficiency. This has been the claim from beginning. And also the 3 agriculture acts that were brought, we all against which there have been a huge mobilization that happened, a historic struggle in which more than 750 farmers became martyrs in that struggle, forcing the government to at least withdraw those acts. The entire philosophy of the government has been to withdraw in line with the dictates of the World Trade Organization and such financial, also the World Bank and other such agencies. That is being implemented. It is the farmers are not at the center of these policies. We have seen even in the latest budget how the allocation for the agriculture has been a huge cut in allocation for crop husbandry, for fertilizer, for food, and for NREG also. According to a study, about 2.64 lakh crores would be required for NREGA if 100 days of work has to be ensured. But only about 73,000 crores has been set aside for NREGA, which is lower than the allocation made last year. So that is the tendency of the trend of this government. Continuously, the talk about limited intervention of government and leaving the farmers at the mercy of the market forces, at the mercy of the corporate companies. I think that is leading to a situation where the farmers' incomes are shrinking in a big way, indebtedness is rising, and the distress is only growing. I think this study by the Foundation of Agrarian Studies is a very important study, surely will bring out how the public spending has been curtailed over the years for agriculture, how that is also a reason for the kind of crisis that the farmers of our country are facing, the agriculture labor of our country are facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vijoo Krishnan. Thank you for raising concerns about declining public expenditures and its consequences on the farming population. I now welcome Dr. S. Niyati as our third panelist for her presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Deepak, and good evening, everyone. I would also like to begin by thanking the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for giving me this opportunity to participate in this panel discussion today. So I was asked by the organizers to specifically focus on the implications of the public spending, the trends in the public spending in agriculture in India on women workers and women farmers in rural Indian context. So, I mean, it goes without much saying that rural women play a very significant role in agriculture and allied activities in India. I mean, they contribute to the agricultural production and post-production labor as cultivators, wage workers, and unpaid family labor. In fact, if you look at the data, even today, a large section, that is around 73% of female rural workers depend on agricultural and allied activities for their employment and livelihoods. In comparison to men, the estimate is like 59%. That is only 59% of male rural workers are dependent on agricultural activities. So what does it mean? So in a context where we are all talking about male out migration, where men are actually diversifying to non-farm work opportunities, and women taking care of the farm management and responsibilities, and an increasing trend of feminization of agriculture, as it is called in the literature, what implications does this trends in public spending in agriculture hold for women workers and farmers in India? So to begin with, my first important concern, which I'll also link to the spending part, is about the issue and concern of the recognition of women farmers in India and women farmers and workers. In fact, in official statistics, women workers are undercounted, and there is a lot of literature which discusses the reasons for undercounting of women's work in official statistics. So one of the important reasons for the undercounting has to do with the nature of work which women do, which is largely unpaid, which is mostly family labor on small farms, which gets undercounted in the official statistics. So this lack of recognition is a very root cause for a lot of problems, because unless and until women workers are recognized, women farmers are recognized, the schemes or the policy documents will also not focus on these issues and concerns of the women workers and farmers. So, and also studies have shown that this non-recognition has left these women out of credit advanced by formal financial institutions and state support schemes. So that is my first and foremost, I just would like to offer this as a backdrop as I speak about the concerns from the trends in public spending. And the other important context in which we are talking and analyzing this public spending in agriculture also has to do with the fact that women have lack of access and control over productive resources. In fact, a study by NCAR, Professor Ram Kumar had mentioned that we really do not have a standardized, reliable statistics on land ownership in India. But if we look at a study by NCAR, it shows that women, in fact, control more than 80% of the farm work and production. And in fact, with male migration to non-farm sector, this share is in fact rising. But despite their role in agriculture production, the land ownership for women is just 13%. That is, on an average, 13% of rural women in India own cultivable land. So these estimates are very low for North Indian states like Uttar Pradesh, where only 5% of women own cultivable land. So why is this a concern, or why is it very important to discuss this, is that, in fact, as mentioned by the previous two speakers, is that there's a sharp decline in the share of allocations towards real production, and there's an increase in share of public expenditure on income support schemes, one of the most important of which is the PM Kisan scheme in the recent years. In fact, since 2019, the PM Kisan has been the largest component of the agricultural budget each year, and it targets specifically at farmers who own cultivable land as per land records of the state. So this statement itself explains why is it a concern. Like I said, that women have very limited access over land, and in fact they do not own land in several parts of the country. So this means that they cannot be the beneficiary of this particular scheme. In fact, a study has revealed that 80% of the beneficiaries of PM Kisan Yojana were men, and there were only very few women who received this particular scheme and income support. It's not just the women, it also leaves out vulnerable sections such as tenant farmers, women workers, tribal families, landless laborers, in fact, the ones who mostly need the income support. So this exclusion is also a result of lack of recognition of these women as farmers. So that is something where I wanted to connect the issue of recognition to the agricultural spending, which is the important component of which is PM Kisan. So though there are, of course, the report also shows that there are few schemes which have been introduced as a subcomponent of National Livelihood Rural Mission, which actually focuses on status of women in agriculture. But evidence suggests that there has not been a tangible impact or positive impact on lives and livelihoods of women in rural India because of this recognition issue. So the other crucial aspect which I would like to focus is the allotment of funds under the MGNREGA scheme. In fact, if I have to mention, in the last around 2 decades, the other important source of employment for rural women workers has been public works generated by the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. In fact, the proportion of women who are part of this MGNREGA workforce is around 52%. And in some states, it is more than 60%. So it's a very important source of employment for rural women workers. So the fact that the budget allocation for rural employment is mostly stagnant, and in fact, it's on marginal decline in the last few years, is of paramount concern when we talk about the women's work opportunities. So in fact, the scheme has suffered budgetary cuts, and in 2020, the funds for the scheme was slashed by rupees 9,500 crores from its previous year revised estimates. So this explains why it is an important issue of concern, and it has clear direct implications on women's employment opportunities in rural India. So while the other important aspect today, which I would like to highlight, is it has to do with the spending on agricultural research and extension. I think it's a very important area and concern for women farmers particularly. So the agriculture sector in India today is facing the challenge of production and food security, particularly in the context of climate change. And in fact, the most important thing which is required is agriculture research, science-led public policy, and public expenditure on agriculture research and education, which is extremely crucial in confronting the challenges that the agriculture sector is facing today. But what do we see from the data and the report is that there is a decline in public expenditure on agriculture research and extension. In fact, according to the recent situational assessment survey, the access to public extension information was lower in this particular 2018-19 in comparison to 12-13, which explains that the situation is worsening. And in fact, the situation is worse for women farmers who lack access to information related to agricultural production. And in a context where we are saying that women are majorly managing farm work with men migrating to non-farm sector for employment opportunities, it's very essential to understand that any efficient technology transfer or adoption can only happen if we have an efficient agricultural extension system. The fact that we don't have that is, or the fact that there is a decline in the agricultural research and extension is of significant concern. And in fact, the other important area which has now got a significant attention from policymakers is also to do with the post-harvest management and the storage, the food storage, and these are some of the concerns where a lot of policymakers are discussing. Food loss, food wastage has become one of the important areas of concern where FAO and UN are all discussing on these issues. So even for this, it's very essential that we need more focus on gender specific training, where women are trained to use these storage technologies and all that. And for that, again, we need agricultural extension and training, which should be an important component, with a renewed focus from the gender point of view should be included. So to conclude, I would say that with an increasing feminization of agriculture, women's recognition as farmers is certainly the most important issue. But while we discuss about that, there should be efforts made to support women farmers in securing their livelihoods, their rights over resources like land, and ensuring entitlements over agricultural services, extension services, training, and provisioning of social security. And all this is not possible without a renewed interest in public spending in agriculture, and with a much more focus on gender implications and social inclusion, and these concerns should also be part of the design. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Niyati, for that presentation. We will take up questions now. There are a few questions which are already in Q&A box and in chat boxes. Before we get into questions and answers, I think Professor Madhura Swaminathan has something to speak. She has been raising a hand. Madhura, if you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
Actually, it wasn't. It is actually me.
Oh, all right, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Maybe Madhura has something to say, but
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Now you are visible. Yeah.
Am I? Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm not visible here. Okay. Yeah, I just want to ask Ram Kumar, Raya, and Abhinav. See, yeah, it is very good. Thank you. Very useful. I just want to know that Ram Kumar said that nothing other than crop support, that income support, has increased in any significant way. But see, what is clear is that the share has fallen. That's any which way you look at it, whatever you put as a denominator, agriculture is doing badly. But what exactly has happened to absolute expenditure in real terms? Is there any, is there a decline? What are the variables for which there was a decline? I mean, that's different from saying it has not increased in any significant way. But has it decelerated? What has happened to absolute expenditure? Is there deceleration? Has there been acceleration in certain spheres? And so on. So what has happened to real absolute expenditures? That's the question.
Professor Ram Kumar, can you take up that question?
Well, in real terms, the total sorry.
Was that the objective of the study? I mean,
it was not. This was a study conducted as part of a global project on agricultural spending by different governments, and this study used a comparable methodology for a cross-country comparison, and that's why shares are given more importance than absolute numbers. But absolute numbers are available, and they do show a certain amount of stagnation outside. If you deduct the PM Kisan allocations from the total agricultural budget, what you see is a stagnation in real terms. And in some schemes, you even see a decline in real terms, absolute sense, of expenditures of the central government. That's the overall point.
No, you're saying schemes or an suppose you were to take
overall expenditure minus PM Kisan has stagnated, and it has even fallen in some years.
Okay, thank you. And what is the tendency after 2011 or so?
This phenomenon has basically arisen after 2011 and 12.
So 2011 and this year.
Professor Ramachandran, let me just finish my point.
Yeah.
Basically, we had an expansion of expenditures between around 2003-04 and about 2010-11. That's the time of a fiscal expansion.
Yeah.
But then, when India began to retreat from its fiscal stimulus program introduced in 2008-09, and particularly after Mr. Chidambaram became the finance minister and took over from Pranab Mukherjee in 2012, you see a a very major program of fiscal compression at the central government level to keep the fiscal deficits, bringing them down to 3%. And that's the time when overall there is fiscal compression, and it happens in agriculture also until 2018 PM Kisan.
I suggested when this is published, you must put in some of the trends in the absolute.
That will be done. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that explanation, Professor Ram Kumar. So we'll get into the questions. So before that, let me just explain that few of our colleagues will be sharing the links in chat box for those of you who want to learn more about women's work and other related aspects of Indian agriculture. For work of women in agriculture, we have brought out a book called Women's Work in Rural Economies, and Nehru will be sharing those links with you. And those interested can take a look at it. Similarly, on the issues of small farmers, we have got another publication, and I hope Nehru will also share that link with everyone. For this discussion, we will mainly focus on public expenditure and issues related to that. So I've seen some questions, and this is for those people who have asked questions about viability of small-scale farming and more about women's role in agriculture. They can probably take a look at these links. Now, yeah, so for continuing on that question about the share and the absolute numbers, there is a question about agriculture research intensity. And this, I suppose, is the percentage of expenditure spent on agriculture research as a proportion of agriculture GDP. Now, there is a recommendation that this should be about 1% at least, but it has remained around 0.6 to 0.7%, and it has been declining in real terms. Now, how do we convince the policymakers that this is an important investment, and what do you have to say about this? This is a question by Ranjita Puskar.
This is one of the most difficult questions I always face. How do you convince the policymaker that he's doing something wrong and has to change? Now, my usual question is only political struggle can change it, but then there's also a lot more to it. The basic, last week I was speaking to agricultural scientists at part of the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences, and this exact question came up during that time as well. Deepak, you may just want to highlight my box as the main box, because you've switched off your video and I think the viewers will only see your name. Yeah, thank you. Now, the key question that they also found very interesting was, why is it that the central government is not raising public expenditure or investment in agricultural research? That I think there has to be, there is partly a problem that a lot of undue criticism of agricultural science has created in this, that it is not such a priority area of investment. That there is the spread of that kind of a thinking even among progressive sections of the society, and that does certainly contribute, at least partly, to this whole consideration of that question as a non-serious one. That's number one. Number two is, I think farmers' organizations, bodies of scientists, etc., have to step up their pressure, their advocacy efforts, etc., towards pushing the central government to invest more in public agricultural research. That is unfortunately not happening as much as it could have probably, and that would also help in we need to make this a public issue, a political issue. Currently, it is not a political issue. It is at best confined to being a technical issue. That's not adequate. So the expenditure on agricultural research, public agricultural research, has to become a political issue in this country. Only then we can at least be partly successful in forcing the central government to act on this. That's my quick answer to that question. Yeah. By the way, 1% is only a short-term goal set by a committee of the ICAR some time back. 10 years have passed since that 1% goal was set, and we are still at 0.65.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Ram Kumar. Vijoo and Niyati, would you like to add on to the response, or shall we go on to the next set of questions?
So, some comments in the chat box. Maybe
sure. Yeah, we'll.
Regarding MSP, there is how many farmers know about Actually, over the last 7 years, I think a greater number of farmers are knowing about MSP and this entire demand for C2 plus 50. But whether they are getting it is notional. Often it is notional because there is no assured procurement. According to the when this budget was presented this year, in terms of wheat and paddy, the procurement was last year it was claimed that 1.97 crore farmers benefited from it. This year's allocations would lead to a drop in that to around 1.63 crores alone. That is the number of people who actually benefit from the MSP for paddy and wheat, according to the government. These also could be contested. And on other crops, while about 23 or 24 crops are the MSP is announced, for most of them there is absolutely no procurement. That is the situation we are having. And even the MSP announced for paddy and wheat, if you look at states like Bihar, for instance, where the APMC markets, all that has been done away with, farmers are being forced to sell at as low as 800 I think, or a high of 1,200, while the MSPs announced this around 1,900 plus. So that is the situation that we are having. One more issue which was raised is regarding the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana. It is, I think, a statement made by one of the viewers that yes, the states are withdrawing from it. It has benefited the corporate companies. Yes, we had been raising it from the very beginning that this Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, where big corporate companies, including multinational companies, have been brought into the agriculture insurance. They have made huge profits from premium collected with shares from the farmers, from the state government, and as well as the central government. So that is, even the CAG has made mention about this huge benefit that some of the insurance companies have gained. I think that is, from my side, that's all I have.
Yeah, but before we go further, I would like to ask this question to all the three panelists about public expenditure by states. How do we see the investment by states? Is it different from that of what is happening at the center, or states are also investing more in, and that also shows a trend of financialization? How do you see this? Maybe Ram Kumar. Yeah.
Yeah, this has to be examined in greater detail, but this study has not attempted that kind of disaggregation as yet, but that's certainly something that needs to be done and disaggregated at the state level. But some studies are there, for example, which do look at some state level trends in this kind of spending. So, for example, in some states, for example, there is a rise across over the last 10 years or so, and in some states there has been a fall. There are studies which show that in states like Karnataka, for example, it has risen slightly, but in states like Gujarat, it has fallen. In Bihar, it has stagnated. In Odisha, it has risen, etc. But these are very disparate trends that you see. And here again, a lot of corrections have to be done in the analysis for the spending by state governments on loan waiver schemes, the spending by state governments on different cash transfer schemes like Kalia, Raitu Bandhu, etc. So you have to net out some of these things and see what has happened to the investment in schemes that benefit the productive sector, the schemes that directly lead to increase in production and productivity. That kind of analysis is very detailed and has not yet been done at all, for sure. And that's certainly something that's worth doing in the future.
I think state governments are often forced to balance between the demand from below and also the shrinking whatever finances they are having at in their hands. So that is a situation that we are having. You have states which are, for instance, you see, Odisha has passed an assembly resolution that per quintal MSP of paddy should be 2,900. But it is unable to do anything in that direction, even provide a little bonus over the MSP announced by the central government. But in the Kerala government is giving about 1,000 rupees more per quintal. Understanding that the cost of production is higher in a state like Kerala, and the MSP that is being announced by the center will not actually be commensurate to the investment made by the farmers. So it is.
Thank you.
It is not easily being done. It is not. It's not an easy thing, but I think it also comes with the pressure that farmers' movements also are able to build. I think that is also.
Yeah.
I don't think I have anything more to add, but I would also say that, I mean, given my limited experience, whatever, I had a chance to work with, opportunity to work with the Kerala State Planning Board, I would say that it's also about the intent. I think that's very essential, the political intent of the state government, which is also very important. Of course, despite the limited resources and all, where do you want to put that resource also depends on the political intent. And I think we can say clearly, like for instance, the agricultural extension and training, the kind of efforts that's being put by the Kerala government on for women farmers is something really exceptional and good, like the kind of efforts put for making sure the training of women to use machinery or farm machinery or the kind of technologies is something very important. So it's also necessary to see that political intent is very important. So that's where I see that.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Now there is a specific question to Niyati about public expenditure on policies for landless laborers, especially for female workers. And there's another connected question about the disparity between agricultural land ownership between North and South India. I mean, do you have any references to make to that, as in about how many within that NCR study that you mentioned, how many within South India got benefited from PM Kisan as opposed to North India? Any such observation? I think the question, question is on that.
Yeah. Thank you, Deepak. So, I mean, the NCAR study is just about the land ownership for women across states. It's not about the PM Kisan beneficiaries. That is to do with the RTI, which was put to know the beneficiaries, and someone had analyzed the information from the response from the government. But regarding this particular thing, why there is a bias or why women do not hold land, I think one of the important answer for that comes from the Hindu Succession Act. I think that explains why there is a gender bias, or why there is lesser access for women on ownership. But I would say that is much better in the South Indian states in compared to, like when I said UP, there's only 5% of women who actually own agricultural land. It was more than 15 or 16% in Kerala, which was the highest in terms of land ownership for women. But I think that difference also comes because of the amendment of the Hindu Succession Act, which happened in a few states like Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Maharashtra between 1970s and 90s, where women also had and were also entitled to the ancestral land and property. So I think that explains some reasons why it's still different in the North Indian states in comparison to the South Indian states. Sorry. Yeah. So the other thing which regarding the schemes, I can probably share some more list of schemes, but the main thing which is being put forward is the as a subcomponent of the National Livelihood Rural Mission. So we have something called Mahila Kisan Sashaktikarna Pariyojana, where they are basically focusing on improving the status of women in agriculture by making sure that farmers are benefited by forming self-help groups, and that kind of schemes are there. But there isn't much literature or evidence which actually say how beneficial these schemes have been, or what exactly has been the impact for women's work and incomes in rural context. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Niyati. So Professor Tankaraj wants to ask a question, and he has sent in as a typed question. So Can anyone explain the types of public expenditure in agriculture? So, Professor Ram Kumar, if you can just quickly.
Well, there are different types and types, but the primary way in which central government classifies it is in the form of a functional classification, which is something that we have followed in this study. The functional classification, as Professor Tangraj knows, is classified into social services and economic services. And under economic services, there is crop husbandry, there is irrigation and flood control, there is rural development, and other such heads. So what this study has done is to look at those kinds of that the functional classification of budgetary expenditures as the basis for the analysis, number one. Number two, there's another way of looking at it in terms of revenue expenditures and capital expenditures, which is also something that this study partly does, not fully. So we do look at the importance of capital expenditure in agriculture, particularly in sectors like irrigation, and how that is related to the overall question of the fiscal stance of the government with respect to agriculture. So there are different ways with this. There's been old way of looking at it in terms of plan and non-plan that exists only in some states now, where planning continues to be a reality, such as Kerala.
One state.
Yeah. One state, which is Kerala. The vice chairman is speaking. So the plan and non-plan is yet another way to look at it. But in the central government schemes now, or central government budgetary documents, that classification has almost disappeared. I hope that answers the question. And if anybody wants to supplement it,
Yeah, sure. So there's one more question. I think this is in relation to the types about climate change and the context in which the spending is happening. So climate change in agriculture, is there any particular scheme, or how has the allocation changed over time? There are a lot of questions which we can club into one such question for now.
So let me comment on that, and I'm sure others can chip in. The first point is this: the broad point about agriculture and climate change is that the official Indian position in the IPCC negotiations has been that agriculture is not the arena for mitigation. Right? Agriculture in India, where yield gaps are very large, where agricultural productivity is very low, and much more input supply can actually help in increasing productivity. We cannot, in this context, see agriculture as an arena of mitigation. It is also important because mitigation is usually spoken about in cases where large-scale industrial agriculture, for example, dairy farms with about 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 animals and so on predominate. In India, the herd size in dairy industry is just 2 or 3 per household. So we do not have industrial agriculture of the scale that the West has. And it is not the burden of countries like India to mitigate in agriculture with respect to climate change. I'm talking about India's official position, and I think I'll agree with that broad position. The second is the central government has been, regardless of this position that they have taken in global forums, they have made much hue and cry about natural farming, climate resilient farming, etc., etc. But the key problem with the approach of the central government is that it has absolutely no regard for modern science when it approaches these questions of climate change or making agriculture resilient to climate change. It basically falls back on pseudoscience. It basically falls back on quackery. It basically falls back on ideas which basically originate from the majoritarian Hindutva ideology, like relying on cow urine and cow dung as replacements for chemical fertilizers, which an idea which has zero space in any agricultural scientist body, and that is the stance of the central government currently with regard to question of even though they say we will not mitigate in agriculture, they have been popularizing completely backward-looking solutions. I wouldn't even call it technological solutions. Solutions of this sort. Nature-based solutions is another new term that has come up globally from the West. This is the position that the Indian government has taken. Plus, they have invested very little in with respect to budgetary allocations to what they find to be their pet projects. They keep talking about natural farming, but even for natural farming, they have not invested anything. Their investment has actually fallen. I think that's a good thing that they violated their own promises, but that's the state of the art.
Thank you, Professor Ramakumar. There's one question related to comparison with OECD countries and whether it is right for us to compare India with advanced capitalist countries in terms of the public expenditure as a percentage of GDP, and whether that comparison would throw light on how pitifully low public spending is in India. There's also a question.
I think that question basically sees the problem upside down. The problem is you become rich and then you invest more in agriculture. That's not how the world has functioned. The world has functioned in the following way. Countries have become rich because they invested more in agriculture, right? Because they invested more in agriculture at a time when their per capita incomes in agriculture were low, or overall per capita incomes were low. That's how they were able to raise productivity. That's how they were able to create an overall structural change in the economy. People moved out of agriculture, industry grew, services grew, and today most of those countries have about 2 or 3 or 4% of their population dependent on agriculture. That's the kind of a broad historical structural change that has happened in those countries. But that began with a substantial allocation to agriculture. They did not begin to invest more in agriculture after they became rich.
In any case, there's this whole question of shares and absolutes, Deepak, to the question. Yeah. It's not merely a question of shares, it's a question of absolutes.
Yeah.
Absolute decline or stagnation. It's not merely a question of...
This is Mridul Epan. I just wanted to say something about what Ram Kumar just said about the developed countries. I think it would be worthwhile looking at how much of that public expenditure in agriculture is actually on subsidies. Because I think that's how they're able to maintain that high level of production, because they're giving so much subsidies to. And subsidies have to be given to agricultural production in the long run anyway, everywhere. So I think that perhaps may be interesting to just see how much this share of subsidies in that total.
Yes, Mridul, I agree. But Mridul is logged in my name, so that's why my name is appearing when she's talking. I gave her my login. But the point is that, Mridul, that's very important. I agree. There is some information in this report on the extent of subsidies, but I think that requires a more detailed interstate analysis as well, as I was trying to point out earlier. Thank you.
Yeah, why I'm saying it is because agriculture has to be sustained in the long run through subsidies, whatever you may say. So that's why I think we have to force that issue that, you shouldn't really decline on the subsidies. And since I'm talking, Deepak, I know you said nothing to be said on women, but if there is time, I'd like to ask a small question, which has always been troubling me. And that is, can a woman be called a farmer if she can get hold of a Kisan card? Because I've been asking people, do women have Kisan cards? And nobody seems to be giving me an answer to that. But supposing we manage to get the Kisan cards, would they be then recognized as farmers? Could it be as simple as that? That's a question which has been always in my mind.
Niyati, you should answer.
Niyati, yeah.
No, I don't think it is just about a card or something. I think the recognition is a lot more deep rooted, and it's not just about getting the Kisan card. It's also about how how the policymakers to everyone look at women as farmers, as cultivators, as someone who are at the first forefront of running the farm production. So I think that's more important. I was talking more on those lines. It's not just mere. I was just giving an example of how even official statistics undercount, but that's just not there. But it's also about, it's not just a formal recognition by giving cards, but I was talking more in the real sense of of the world.
No, I know that. I know that it's
Yeah.
not just a question of, I know that there is a structural problem. You're not recognized
Yes.
as, but I'm saying, supposing we took it at face value and said, okay, let's give Kisan cards to all women. Would it be made, would they be farmers? Or is it just a political question? They don't want to give it because they don't want to recognize them as farmers. That's
Yes, I think it's the other way. Yeah, they won't give it because they don't want to recognize in the real sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have come to an end. So
can I just add a sentence?
Sure. Yeah.
Just to Mridul's point. Mridul, the question is also from what perspective are you looking at the problem? Are you trying as an academic, as a social scientist with an agrarian perspective, if you're looking at the problem, then you have a very different definition of who a woman farmer is. But in the sense that we are talking about in this presentation, it's about who can be a beneficiary of schemes of the government which are meant for farmers. And if you look at it in that sense, only one person can be a recipient in a family, and that person is usually the male, because the land is registered in the male, and that is because the guidelines of the scheme state that the owner of the land record, the owner in the land record, is the recipient. So
I was looking at it in the second way, but I thought if men are migrating and women are actually looking after it, and she's the one looking after it.
I think we're also dealing with a very narrow, that doesn't mean unimportant. Mridul is dealing with a very narrow question. If you have a KCC, are you a farmer by definition? And that's the question, right?
Yeah.
That would have certain implications. So
yes, in terms of benefits.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. So I'm really sorry we'll have to end our discussion, but there are a lot more questions about public expenditure and public tax, then about other frameworks to see how we can increase spending, and about small scale farming and the future of it. We're not able to take all of that in this discussion, but we will definitely have much more discussions in future, and we can have a detailed discussion over those questions as well. Now, for more on invisible work, defining women's work, women and women and patterns of women's employment, I think the panelists have talked about this, and the participants are free to take a look at our website, and the links are shared in the chat box about FAS's book on women's work in rural economies. So I end the panel discussion now. Thank you, the panelists, and I formally hand over the mic to Professor V.K. Ramachandran, who is trustee of Foundation for Agrarian Studies, for a vote of thanks. Over to you, V.K.
Thank you very briefly. Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. We had only one in 90 minutes. Raya, Abhinav, Ram Kumar, Vijoo, and Niyati, you packed a great deal of information into the presentation. It was very useful for all of us. And thank you also, Deepak, for keeping unfortunately, we had to narrow the discussions to the question of public finance. I hope this is one more of many such discussions. It was really very useful. Thank you all once again. It was, and I look forward to this. We're going to publish the report soon, but perhaps we should have some more on the absolutes, because it also has implications for the question that was asked about the EU. Ultimately, we've got, we'll have to think about what long-term path of development is there for countries which are rich in biodiversity, which are biodiversity rich. They obviously will follow a different, from the main European countries. They will follow a different path. When China's path, being the richness of its biodiversity, has, despite industrialization, despite a shift of share away from agriculture, it has also been a future in which agriculture plays a very important role in growth, self-sufficiency, sovereignty, and so on. And countries which do have the kind of biodiversity wealth that India has will continue to use agriculture as a locomotive for growth and prosperity in a way that countries which are not so well endowed cannot. Anyway, let me not go into that. That's a discussion for the future. But thank you once again to the speakers, panelists, and all the participants. Thanks again. And congratulations once again to FAS for organizing it very well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Nehira?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We'll be ending this webinar now. Thank you.